You good to go? You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Wonky Weekly.
I'm Rashaan II.
And I'm Sid Solomon. We are going to take you to Wonky Town.
Wonky Town.
Thank you. There it is.
Wonky Town.
That just, my God, my heart explodes. I'm so happy. Hi, Rashaan. How are you?
I'm well. How are you? This is my fourth Zoom today. Oh no, it's my fifth. It's my fifth. We had convention before this.
We did. We just came both of us from a meeting of the convention committee. So hi. You are in a different environment than
I
you
sure am.
Where are you?
And so they're drilling like the side of my building in my apartment, as you do. So like every maybe 9 seconds, I hear. Vroom, vroom. So I came to AMDA where I teach to like sit in one of the studios to record this. I'm sure one of my students is going to open the door and scream something because college students are unwieldy.
Sure. Yeah. If you're wondering why this episode's a little late this week, it's because we sat down to record on Wednesday and all of a sudden there was this drilling that started happening. So apologies, but here we are. So Rashaan, since the last time that we had an episode, there has been some very exciting news at Equity regarding the waitress tour, specifically the non-union waitress tour. You want to talk a little bit about what's going on?
Yeah. So the non-union waitress tour has the exact same sets, the exact same costumes, the exact same everything as the Broadway and the touring. And so the actors said, we want to go union. They decided that they want to be represented by Actors Equity Association. So AEA has just filed with the NLRB to say, let's go. And so I'm excited about this. We're in like the land of like new, organized, young, strong labor, like the Starbucks in Staten Island, Amazon in Staten Island, the Starbucks in Buffalo. And like, this is like with the trend of union and labor, like strong. So I'm so down for it. I'm so happy and excited to be living in a time where labor is doing this. And so, yeah.
I'm sure it won't surprise you. I have been diving headfirst into reading as much as I can about this kind of organizing, what's called card check organizing. And I imagine that probably pretty soon we'll do an entire episode about that. But I just wanted to make sure we mentioned it. And if you are interested in lending your support to the stage managers and actors of the non-union waitress tour, hop on over to actorsequity.org, to the union's website, to all of its social media. There's lots of ways that you can get involved, whether you are in or outside the industry. Let's give those workers our support. So exciting, so amazing. So today, Rashaan, we are going to be discussing an interesting topic, a topic that we teased a little bit at the end of episode 3. What are we talking about today?
Oh, concessions.
Oh, concessions, contract concessions. And this is going to be an episode in which we talk about how things work, but also I imagine, Rashaan, an episode where there will be some opinion sharing, I would imagine.
Maybe just a little bit.
Maybe just a little bit. So I've been thinking all week about how best to set this up. And I think the best way to sort of contextualize contract concessions, as we use those words at Equity, is to go back to some of the stuff that we covered in episode 3 with contracts and ratification. And Rashaan, because between the two of us, you have significantly more experience on contract negotiating teams. This is a really good place for me to lean on you. So in episode 3, we talked about that when a union and an employer or a group of employers negotiate with each other, federal law requires that at the bargaining table, they bargain with each other in good faith. Can you talk about how that requirement to bargain in good faith plays out? What does it look like in real time at the bargaining table?
Actors Equity brings thing A, we'll call it thing A, to the table. And thing A slowly morphs into something that looks a little bit more like A1, then A2, then A5, then A7. But employer brings B to the table and Equity says, we're not sure about that. And we say, well, maybe you can have your B with no different version if we go back to A version 1.1. And the exchange goes back and forth like that until there is consensus between both sides of the table of what the proposal will look like in the actual agreement. In real time, the conversations the conversations can happen directly at the table, but sometimes we like disappear from the table and we say, well, this is the thing that we have to put our foot down, and when we go back to the table, that's how it's going to work. Or we have the conversation with the employer side and say, well, we're willing to do this if you're willing to do this, and it happens. A lot of the time, it will happen with the chair and chief negotiator talking like as it's happening. It's like in real time. It's not one of those, well, let's come back, let's go away and then think about it and come back. We're hammering things out right as it goes.
Right. And, something you said in episode 3 that was so right on the head is that it's such a give and take. But what the good faith requirement really requires of both sides is that you can never just say no. If the union puts forward a whole bunch of proposals, the employers can't just say, no, we're not going to do any of that. Sorry. Same in the opposite direction. If the employers come with like a bunch of things, equity can't just say no. You have to be willing to go back and forth. You have to be willing to give and to get. And that's the law. That's how it applies. And that's what bargaining with our employers at the bargaining table looks like. Both sides know that that's a requirement. Both sides engage in good faith bargaining. Hopefully it doesn't get to a point where somebody is outside of good faith. But you engage, you give, you get, you take, you adjust, you compromise, and then you come to terms. You come to a final agreement, it gets ratified, and then that's the collective bargaining agreement. And a collective bargaining agreement has typically a term, like it has a length to it. I think, Rashaan, the shortest length of a CBA I've ever seen is a year. I can't think of a CBA that I've ever seen at Equity that's shorter than a year. Can you think of one off the top of your head?
I can't think of one shorter than a year. I mean, the ones that I deal with generally are even longer than a year. They range between 3 and 5 years.
Right. I don't think at Equity I've ever seen anything longer than 5 years. Can you think of anything longer than 5? No. And I'd say generally, especially for our larger multi-employer collective bargaining agreements, we're typically talking between 3 and 5 years, unless you're talking about like a 1-year extension or if there's like a stopgap for a couple of years or something. But usually, most CBAs will last somewhere between 1 and 5 years at Equity. So, Rashaan, negotiations happen. The employers and the union come to an agreement. The contract gets ratified. The contract says it's going to last for 3 years. So if we were to ratify a 3-year agreement today, it would expire on this date in 2025. What is an employer's expectation of the union when we've come to terms? What do they expect us to do with regards to that agreement?
To uphold the agreement at all times.
Yes.
Until the date it no longer exists.
Right. The employer expects that we, the union and its members, will abide by the terms of that agreement. In the same way, what do we think the union's expectation should be of the employers?
Our union or unions?
I mean, what do we hope our union's expectation would be of our employers?
So we're not quite at the opinion moment. That they will also uphold their end of the deal. Yes. And abide by the terms of the contract.
Right. And that to me seems pretty simple. You come to terms at the bargaining table, and at the bargaining table, there are duties of bargaining in good faith that are, set forth by federal law. And when you come to terms for a set period of time, both sides reasonably expect that the other side will adhere to and uphold the terms of that agreement for that set amount of time until it expires, at which point you come back and you do the whole thing again. And it's just this cycle and cycle and cycle. So now we come to concessions. A concession request from an employer is when an employer comes to Equity, calls up on the phone and says, so I know we have this collective bargaining agreement that we agreed to and that we had the opportunity to bargain with you about and to give things and to get things all in good faith. And we know it doesn't expire for another 1, 2, 3, 4 years, but there's something that we'd like to change. How do you feel about that? how do you feel about giving us something additional right now? That's a concession request. When an employer comes to the union and says, despite what we agreed to at the bargaining table, we would like something to change. Now, in general, Rashaan, here's an opportunity for an opinion. What do you think generally our answer to an employer that asks for such a thing should be?
Absolutely not.
Why?
Because we came to terms on an agreement that has been ratified by members. Therefore, those members believe that it will be upheld. So what we're doing is we are changing our minds, in our members' minds on that agreement. So no.
Can you think of situations in which you might be willing to have an employer come to the union in the middle of an agreement and make an adjustment for an employer? Can you give an example of when you might be okay with such a thing?
I tend to say no to concessions almost all the time. I can't, as the former chair of deputy, as the co-chair now of stock, I get a lot of them, and then as a vice chair of ACCA, I'm almost always in the no category. So I can't, and I'm generally outvoted, but I can't think of somewhere where I feel it's acceptable for them to have asked. But if I were to answer that question honestly, the one thing would be is if our members are getting something from giving.
Sure.
And, well, that's the end of that sentence.
And that's a really, I think, important distinction because, and again, this is where the way we use the words we use becomes important because concession typically means that the employer is coming to the union and saying, despite what we agreed to, we'd like a change. And the union says, sure. However, if an employer comes to the union in the middle of the term of an agreement and says, we'd like a change, the union's response can be, well, if you would like to reopen the terms of this agreement and place some more give and get, not quite at the bargaining table, but if you'd like to engage in what is generally called midterm bargaining, we can do that, but you had better be ready to receive a counter offer to what you're asking for. If you're going to get something from us, you're going to need to give us something. That is bargaining, and that can take place. Now, I will say, Rashaan, something that bothers me about concessions and the fact that equity does and historically has granted concessions is that it leads to what I call an asymmetry between how employers go about changing their agreements and how members can go about changing their agreements. Because at the end of the day, the union is a member-driven organization. So let's go back. Can you walk us through, say that you're a member of equity, imagine that, and you have an idea for a way that a contract could be improved. Let's use the coursed contract because it's a stock contract and you've been involved, you've negotiated the coursed contract, right?
I have, yes.
Okay, so this is equity's collective bargaining agreement with the Council of Resident Stock Leaders. Let's say that you are a rank and file member who has just worked the coursed contract and there was a provision in that contract that you thought could be better. What are the steps that you would need to take as a member to get that piece of the contract changed? How would you go about that?
Oh man, so there's actually very few routes. If I wanted it there and now, I would have to find a way to get that idea into governance. So get it into the stock committee. The stock committee would talk about it. The stock committee would talk about it and probably make some sort of policy that they would say, okay, we will negotiate that at the end of this cycle. So it wouldn't happen right on the dot, it wouldn't change that day. Or the other way is if I waited until they were like, hey, member who worked during this contract cycle, what were the things about this contract that you didn't like? And I typed in that thing, that would get to the committee / the negotiating team and perhaps get negotiated. Not necessarily, because the negotiating priorities don't always necessarily line up with the member feedback.
Right. So if a member were to go to the staff, directly to the staff, if they were to say, that governance process is too convoluted for me, there's no guarantee my thing would be fixed. If a rank and file member were to go to the staff and say, this part of the contract could be improved and should be improved right now. I'd like you to take it to the employers right now and ask them to change it. What would that staff member say?
We will not do that.
We can't. We won't do that. We can't do that. We cannot go to our employers and just ask them to change a piece of the agreement. We would never do that for our members. And yet, that essentially is exactly what a concession request is. An employer coming to us during the course of the agreement saying, we'd like this thing changed now without having to wait for negotiations. And the union saying, yeah, sure. That asymmetry has always bothered me. That's something we would not do for the member that we represent, we will consider doing for the employer. And that even when a member goes through the right process of going through governance, getting it to the committee, getting it to the negotiating team, getting it approved by the council, hoping it makes it into the priorities, and then hoping that it survives through that whole bargaining process, that our employers still historically have an easier time getting things changed in our agreements than our members do. This is an odd, perhaps, comparison. I have a new dog here at my apartment. We've just adopted a 5-year-old rescue dachshund that we've named Indiana. And Indiana is getting used to living in our home, which requires some amount of training. And I am terrible at dog training because, the minute that a dog makes eyes at me or cries at me, I will do whatever that dog wants. But that's not a good way to train an animal to behave the right way. You can't just give them what they want when they look sad or when they cry about it. That if you train your employers that the way they can get things changed is in the middle of the term of their agreement, they're going to keep doing that. And rather than wait till actual bargaining happens at the negotiating table where they're required by law to bargain in good faith, if they just say, hey, we won't ask for that at the table, we'll just wait till after we've come to agreement and maybe wait 6 months and then ask for it as a concession, maybe we'll get it. And we won't have had to spend any bargaining capital at the table. And that, in a very macro sense, I don't think is a great practice. Now, Rashaan, there are plenty of people within equity governance who would not necessarily agree with us about this. There are people who think that concessions are a useful tool. Are you able to make the best possible argument for the other side of this discussion? It's like debate club. What's the best argument you can come up with for why concessions are good?
These concessions are what the show needs, which is what our members need. So in order to have this concession, it'll make our members more successful in the show.
Yeah, I've heard that before, and not an unreasonable argument. I will also say another argument I've heard on the other side of this, a good argument, a valid argument, though one I don't necessarily agree with, is that in a union where we, as we discussed in episode 3, give employers who are not members of a certain multi-employer group access to that multi-employer group's contract. For instance, the LORT agreement. All of the actual members of LORT use the LORT agreement, but there are also a dozen or so other theaters that are not members of LORT that equity has essentially handed the LORT contract to. That those theaters might need more flexibility because they are part of they're using a CBA that they weren't a part of negotiating. So, Rashaan, to the person who says each show is different, each employer is different, we need to be able to be flexible, what would you say in response to them?
We are not the ones that necessarily need to be flexible. You can build flexibility into your contract with your own employer group.
Yes, I would agree. This is a really dynamic viewing here when there's just two people who agree with each other a lot. No, but it's true. Why, Rashaan, we discussed this. Why do employers team up with each other? Why do employers create multi-employer groups to bargain with the union?
For strength.
For strength. They choose to team up. We do not tell any employers, hey, create a large multi-employer group that we will then have to negotiate with. We as a union are stronger when we're negotiating with one employer. when they team up in a team of 70 or 80 different employers, they have all of this strength. Something that an employer needs to consider when they team up with a big team is that what they gain in strength, they might lose in flexibility of the agreement. They have decided to enter into one big agreement that will apply to all of those theaters, and they need to negotiate that flexibility into the contract. And if they have not been able to achieve that flexibility into the contract, they need to come back the next time around and get it, especially when, because of good faith requirements, we will be able to ask for things in return for that flexibility. As for the employers that are using a collective bargaining agreement that they were not a party to the negotiations with, what would you say to that?
I don't love it. And
you don't love that, you don't love the argument, or you don't love that we do that?
I don't love that we do that.
No.
Because the good things about it, they don't have to negotiate, and the bad things about it, they get to fix.
Right. So, I mean, Rashaan, you and I don't always agree about everything.
Correct.
In fact, literally, we just came from a meeting where we disagreed about a bunch of things. And the meeting before that, too, you like really disagreed with me about something. How dare you? But this is a place where we tend to sort of be on the same page, where this is one of those things that's sort of how equity has operated for a while. And when both of us came in and learned a lot about how things worked, it was one of those things that we kept sort of looking at each other being like, why do we do things this way? Maybe there's a better structure for how we do this. I'm wondering, Rashaan, if we should encourage anybody, but particularly people within equity governance or who have experience with equity governance, if they disagree with us on this, if we should invite them to reach out to us and see if they'd be willing to come onto Wonky Weekly and talk to us about it.
I would love that.
And this is an important thing. You know, like I just said, Rashaan and I, we don't always agree about things. And there are lots of people who I've served with as counselors and delegates who I really love and admire and respect personally, despite the fact that we have sometimes small and sometimes big disagreements about equity policy. I generally think that's a good thing. So if you happen to be watching this and you've got a strong opinion about how equity grants concessions, why concessions might be a good thing, despite how Rashaan and I feel about them, drop us a line at wonkyweekly.com. Reach out to us directly if you know us, and even if you don't, reach out to us directly, because this is how things work at equity right now. It's always worth talking about how things might be different moving forward.
So Sid, I'll ask you. I never get to ask you the questions. So if I'm an employer and I've just called equity and I say, hey, I want this thing, and make a concession request, what happens? Where does it go?
That's a good question. And I think it really depends. It depends on a handful of things. So each contract generally has a committee that's overseeing it. The production contract has the production contract committee, the LORT contract has the LORT contract committee, all the various stock contracts are overseen by the stock committee. And then there are staff members who are attached to business reps and senior business reps who are working on those contracts. Sometimes all the theaters that use that contract, or sometimes the theaters in one particular region who use that contract. And it's the business reps who are typically going to field those calls. The employers call the business rep and say, hey, I'd like a concession. Now, some committees have said to the staff, here are the kinds of concessions that we will never say yes to. So if an employer calls, you can just tell them no. And the answer is just no. And so the business rep will do that. And more often than not, that'll be the end of the conversation. And there are things, I believe, if I understand it correctly, there are things that the business reps will just feel empowered to say no to, that they will just say, no, that's not in the contract. I don't think that's reasonable. I don't think anybody's going to agree to that. So we're going to ask you to abide by the contract. But in a case where either the business rep thinks that the contract concession request might be reasonable, or that the committee overseeing the contract might consider it, or they've said no, but the employer keeps coming back and keeps coming back and keeps coming back, and they want some amount of backup from the elected leadership, that will then generally go to the committee that oversees the contract. So concession requests very often are the bulk of the work taken up by contract committees in between negotiating cycles. It is not uncommon to show up to a contract committee meeting and the agenda list is 6 different contract concession requests. Now, as we've discussed in previous episodes, sometimes when something like that is sent to a committee, it'll be taken up by the full committee, meaning whoever happens to be able to show up to a committee meeting on the day that it's called. Sometimes, for expediency's sake, it will be taken up by the committee chair and their vice chairs. And sometimes, in hopefully very limited circumstances, it can be taken up only by the chair themselves. And the way equities structures currently work is that any of those combinations of people, either the full committee or the chair and the vice chairs or the chair themselves, is empowered to grant that concession request. Now, mind you, as we discussed in our governance episode, because we are a nationally governed union without local structure, all governance decisions ultimately are the responsibility of the National Council. So whether it's a committee, a group of chair and vice chairs, or a chair by themselves, they might be the one or ones checking the box, but it's the council that's ultimately responsible. And there are rules in place, at least as I remember them, that allow essentially a concession being granted, that decision to be appealed. If somebody on a committee says, I know the committee voted to grant that concession, but I've really got reservations about it, I want to appeal that decision, then that decision gets kicked up to the next level of governance. So that would mean if it's a regional committee, that might get kicked up to the regional board. If it's a national committee, it might get kicked directly up to the National Council. And then those larger bodies will have to decide that. That doesn't happen a lot, or at least not in my experience in my 5 years on council. It has happened before. It has happened before. I've seen it happen where the committee says, yeah, sure, that's fine. But then there's an objection and it comes up to the regional board or the council, and then they decide as a fully constituted body. There are also rules in place that allow certain senior staff members to put a hold on a concession that's been granted by an elected. If a senior staff member sees the concession and says, nah, I understand why they voted on this, but this is not a good idea for a reason that I understand, they can also then kick it up to the next larger body. But that's how the structure has worked for quite a while at Equity, that those decisions typically are made at the committee level, with processes that can kick it up to the larger bodies overseeing the committee. But again, always important to remember, the National Council, all the members of the National Council collectively are always collectively responsible for any governance decisions made by the committees that they oversee and the members thereof. Just always an important thing to remember. Does that all make sense?
That 100%. Yeah.
Okay. That's the Wonky right there. That's Wonky Town, where I just went. I took you to Wonky Town.
Thank you.
I'll also say, Rashaan, have you ever worked on a contract, signed your agreement, negotiated it, gone to your workplace, and then found out that a concession had been granted to that employer for that contract that you didn't know about?
100%, more than once.
Yeah. And that's also, and that's like an administrative problem as much as it is a policy problem. Like, I personally don't like concessions in the first place, but especially when the CBA's established like the minimum baseline of how you're going to be treated by an employer. If you don't know that the union has granted that employer an exception to that, then you can't negotiate around it. But yeah, that I know has been an issue. You never want to show up to work on a contract and find out that contract is different than what you thought you were getting into. Never fun. What else? Is that it? You think we got it?
We can wrap it up.
All right. Well, thank you again, everybody, for joining us for another episode of Wonky Weekly. I'm Sid Solomon.
I'm Rashaan James II.
And we will see you on the next stop after Wonky Town. Is that how that works? Is it like a train?
Do you have a map?
I don't.
I can check my phone.
Okay, you do that. We're going to go. Okay. Bye, everybody.